Okay, hello everyone. This is Jim Landon. I'm with the Alaska eHealth Network, and I'm here with Mike Messick, Chief Technology Officer at Digital Securus. And we're here today. Actually, Mike will do most of this. I just wanted to provide some intros and maybe set the context. Thanks so much for joining us in our second webinar surrounding meaningful use and privacy and security, and what we're referring to as HIPAA 201. Can you hit the next slide there, please?
Yeah, you bet.
Next one, please. So you can probably just hit all of those if you would, please. So essentially, as we talk about meaningful use, really as defined by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, affectionately called ARRA, that refers to the use of a certified electronic health record in a meaningful manner, such as e-prescribing. It also includes electronic exchange of health information to improve quality of care, and certainly using certified electronic health technology to submit clinical quality and other measures. And the main purpose of this graphic here that you see is really showing the evolution of stage 1 to stage 3 meaningful use. And in terms of privacy and security, the real importance of privacy and security, and really the increasing emphasis and in terms of criteria moving throughout the various stages as it relates to the meaningful use program. While stage 1 is focused on adoption and implementation and use of basic electronic health record functionality, when we head out toward stages 2 and 3, we do see increased access to information, care coordination, as well as ideally towards stage 3, improve population health and enhance access and continuity, et cetera. And so that's where we hope to head. And stage 2 we're anticipating in 2014, and stage 3 is subject to further scrutiny somewhere around implementation around 2016. So not to worry about that yet. And next slide, please.
Yeah.
So just a quick note as we look at meaningful use stage 1 requirements. What we're looking at is 14 core measures, and of course the context of where Mike will jump in here is that one of the measures, measure 14, with respect to the electronic health record CMS incentive program, is protect electronic health information created or maintained by the certified EHR. In addition, there's 5 menu set objectives and 6 clinical quality measures. And toward the end, any of my colleagues, Georgiana, Aaron, or myself can assist you in your journey. And Mike, take off.
All right. Jim, thank you very much. I want to give a introduction on Digital Securus for those of you who have not worked with us yet. Securus is an information security and consulting company that's been around, I believe since 2005 is when we formally hung our shingle out. We provide risk management, risk assessments, information security services, research, vulnerability assessments. We also do computer forensics on my partner's side of the house. That's Glenn Clinton. So I think it was earlier this year we formed a partnership with the Alaska eHealth Network to provide risk analyses or risk assessments to AeHN clients as part of their steps to achieving stage 1 meaningful use. So the talk today is going to be essentially about meaningful use, about privacy, the HIPAA security rule, and kind of just touching on a lot of things, basically where we're at today and how to move forward. So first of all, why should we even care about privacy and security? And as Jim has shown you here, CMS says that we have to care. The core objective, Measure 14, says that you have to do a risk analysis and the follow-up risk management steps as part of your attestation. And that's great. You know, from an information security standpoint, Digital Securus feels that CMS is on the right track as far as you know, requiring various security controls, et cetera. What we do find from working with various medical providers and even other clients in non-medical industries is that by and large, implementing the appropriate security controls seems it's onerous if you're not used to having security as a built-in integrated component of your business environment. So there's been some challenges there, and we step forward and help our clients in meeting those challenges as they look to implement various security controls. So CMS says we have to care about privacy and security, and that's all great. But Digital Securus kind of takes a little bit different view as well. In addition to CMS saying you have to, we feel that we should care about privacy and security because it's the right thing to do. As I think about this in the medical industry, nobody likes that feeling of violation when private information about them becomes no longer private. No one wants to visit a doctor whom they know is going to go out and blab about their health conditions to all of his friends and anyone else that he might meet. Given that, providers they must protect electronic information as an extension of that doctor-patient confidentiality that everybody values so highly. Failure to protect electronic PHI violates that same rule of confidentiality. So really what it comes down to is, do you want to be responsible for losing someone's private information that they've entrusted to you as a medical provider? So, you know, it's really that feeling of responsibility for other people's private information. My mother's information has been breached a couple of times now. It gets to be a very personal feeling when you find out that your own information or your relative's information is now floating around in the hands of people that you've never met and have no idea what their intentions are. I wanted to bring this up. Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services has what's colloquially referred to as the Wall of Shame. And here's the URL for it. It is a listing of all healthcare breaches since they started reporting these and publishing them. And I think the list right now only goes up to, I think there's some still in 2013, but there's more they're still adding them on a daily basis. As an Alaskan provider, you might think that data breaches are something that happen to the big hospitals and the big university research centers down south. It doesn't happen to small mom and pop or one or two provider healthcare clinics, especially up here in little old Alaska. But when you look at the reporting database here, there are 3 entities already listed for Alaska. And I personally know of a couple more that have not yet made it to this list. So the idea that it can't happen to me is rapidly being proven to be inaccurate. So there has to be this push for improved security around our electronic records, and that's a part of what meaningful use and the HIPAA security rule attempts to do. So before we get too far into the discussion around meaningful use and the HIPAA security rule, et cetera, I wanted to lay some foundational definitions. First of all, meaningful use for the purpose of our talk here today is essentially a collection of EHR implementation objectives. If you accept funds from the federal government to implement an electronic health record system in your practice, you have to meet these certain criteria to essentially prove that you're using that electronic system in a meaningful fashion. The HIPAA security rule is slightly different. The HIPAA security rule has been around since the inception of HIPAA, and it is essentially a collection of rules that protect electronic PHI. The HIPAA privacy rule is a collection of rules that protect the privacy of all PHI, whether it's electronic or in hard copy format. Meaningful use core objective 14 is what we're going to focus on today, and that is essentially the meaningful use requirement to perform a risk analysis and the follow-on risk management steps to deal with the security issues that are found from the risk analysis. The security rule itself is a collection of a lot of different controls. Some of those security controls are administrative in nature, such as business practices and processes and policies. Some of those controls are technical in nature, such as firewalls and passwords and VPNs, and you know, that's where the IT folks tend to start rattling off the alphabet soup. But there's also physical security controls in place. Those consist of things like, well, keys to the front door. Some practices have alarms and motion detectors. Some have cameras. Some have really elaborate data centers where you have to have card key access and all that. So all of those three different types of controls come together under the HIPAA security rule to provide appropriate and reasonable protection of electronic PHI. And that term appropriate and reasonable is going to resound throughout the security rule, because the idea behind the security rule is that one size doesn't fit all. You can't implement all sorts of security controls in every single environment that you come into because everybody's business is slightly different. So what might be right for a one provider healthcare clinic is not going to be appropriate or reasonable for a hospital. So that's part of where the risk analysis comes in. The risk analysis really drives that idea of reasonable and appropriate. If you do your risk analysis and you find out that, hey, this risk really isn't that big of a deal for our practice, then you can document that and potentially even choose to just accept that risk if it's sufficiently low. So meaningful use, and I try and think of these things in plain English terms. Meaningful use is short-term checkbox compliance, kind of, but as Jim talked about earlier, really what we see in meaningful use is that privacy and security is a recurring theme throughout all three stages of meaningful use. But for attestation purposes, it's a one-time deal right before you attest. The security rule, that's been around since the inception of HIPAA. That's long-term. It's supposed to be ongoing compliance with all of the different requirements in the security rule. So we're required to do this risk analysis by meaningful use. What is a risk analysis? And I wanted to try and give you an idea of not so much the inner workings of a risk analysis, but just kind of what you can expect from anybody who provides a risk analysis for you, whether it be Digital Securus or any other professional consultant who is versed in risk analysis and risk management. Or if you do it yourself, you can certainly go examine any of the methodologies that are out there and follow the steps and do it yourself as well. There's lots of different methodologies out there. CMS refers to NIST 800-30. NIST stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, I think. They have come up with essentially this methodology that is used by a lot of federal government agencies. There's the High Trust Common Security Framework. There's ISO 27005. There's the NSA IAM, the IOU-12. Well, hopefully I don't owe anybody anything, but there's lots of different methodologies. They're all alphabet soup. When you sit down to look at them, they are very, very challenging to understand, even for someone who's well-versed in risk management and risk analysis. But at a minimum, the deliverables that are going to come out of a risk analysis are going to be a list of your assets. Where is the EPHI stored in your environment? A lot of people that Digital Securus talks to, healthcare providers, when we ask them this question, where is your EPHI? The answer many times is, oh, it's in our EHR. And that's all cloud-based, so we're good to go because the cloud provider handles all of that security for us. The truth is, upon further examination, almost always you have other assets in your environment that either store, process, or transmit EPHI. Desktop machines, if you're writing any sort of notes in Microsoft Word or Excel, or if you're sending emails to other people within your practice, those all can contain EPHI. Even the network that you use technically contains PHI, even when you're communicating with a cloud-based provider. If you have your EHR on site, then certainly the network between the server and the client and between the EHR server and the desktop machines, that transmits PHI. So asset identification is not as easy as, oh, it's the EHR and our scope stops there. Another thing that's going to come out of a risk analysis is essentially the identification of risks to your EPHI assets. And those risks are identified through various different means. But without getting too deep into those, really the important thing that you get out of a risk analysis is the assessment of the risk severity for each of those risks. That can be either quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative is an industry term that means assign various components of the risk's numerical values, and at the end of the day, a risk that has a value of 100 is far more severe than a risk that has a value of, say, 5. Qualitative is a little more subjective, although actually the whole risk analysis process is subjective. But qualitative essentially means we put risks into one of about 3 or 4 different buckets: low, medium, high, and maybe critical or severe. So once you've got the risk severity identified for each of the risks, then what you should have out of your risk analysis is recommendations for mitigating controls. Now these are just recommendations. And they're going to come from either the result of your own risk analysis or the results of the knowledge and experience from any sort of a professional that you engage to do that risk analysis for you. But those recommendations then play directly into the risk management process. And the last point I wanted to make about a risk analysis is that, it absolutely can be done internally. There's a lot of really good guidance out there put out by CMS on how to do a risk analysis, especially for a small provider. Based on the results of the last few years' worth of audits, the predominant finding in audits being that I think it was 68% of all audits conducted found that there was either no risk analysis done or an insufficient risk analysis was done. Based on those, it's rapidly becoming a best practice to engage an outside consultant who is well versed in the art or the science, I guess, of risk analysis and risk management. Okay, so we've done our risk analysis. If you've engaged Digital Securus to do that risk analysis, the first thing that you're going to see on your report is a prioritized list of recommendations. The first few of those recommendations are going to be ones that we feel you have to do immediately to stop any bleeding, and that, figuratively. Every so often we go into an environment and perform a risk analysis and find very critical vulnerabilities in that environment or holes in their business practices, etc., that put them at a very, very high level of risk for a compromise, essentially a data breach. So we'll put those recommendations right at the top of the list. And when we sit down with our clients, we say, hey, you've got to do these first. Then let's move on to the whole risk management phase. So the risk management phase, we'll get into that here in a minute, and we'll kind of explore in detail what all the different steps of risk management are. After you do the risk management step for, as part of the meaningful use, attestation requirements, long term, you're going to want to develop an overall security management program. And this security management program it's an overarching business process that is comprised of schedules, and the schedules are going to be things like, we're going to review our overall security management program once a year. We're going to do a risk analysis once every year, etc. We're going to review our policies once a year. There's also going to be roles and responsibilities defined in the security management program. Specifically, what comes to mind are the security officer and the privacy officer for your practice. CMS and the HIPAA security rule require the identification of a specific person or job function whose responsibility it is to ensure compliance with the security rule and that they actually enforce the compliance internally within the practice. So there's those roles and responsibilities. Maybe they're going to list that the owners review all the policies once a year for appropriateness as well. Then there's also going to be electronic components in your security management program. Part of a risk analysis is actually going and looking at electronic vulnerabilities in your environment. We're going to look at the disaster recovery and backup restoration tests, identity and access management. That's fancy words for just user IDs and passwords and how you manage those. Log management is a big issue. The security rule requires that security event logs are retained for 6 years for forensic investigative purposes, and that's a very tall order to fill. Antivirus software is also another electronic component that you would include in your overall security management program. Physical components for the security management program would consist of things like looking at the physical location of your practice. Whether it's a standalone building, is it located in a larger building with hired security guards, etc. From that, you're going to decide what sort of doors, locks, alarms, etc. You want to have present in your environment to protect electronic PHI and even printed PHI from theft, from unauthorized access. Physical components can also include things like fire sprinkler systems. They can protect or minimize or mitigate the damage from natural disasters, from fires and floods and things like that. Then there's also administrative components, and these are going to be a lot of your policies, procedures, and also testing of those procedures. Some big ones that come to mind, mainly because they are what are being identified as the result of audits, are incident response procedures and testing of those. The security rule actually requires that you test your incident response processes periodically to make sure that they're viable, make sure that they actually work. So if you do detect a security event in your electronic systems, what do you do next? Who do you call? What do they do? How do you communicate with each other? How do you investigate the incident, etc.? Same goes for data breach procedures and testing. If you do have a data breach, who do you call? What are your next steps? Data breach reporting is getting increasingly complex due to individual states having dissimilar requirements. There are now states where if you, say, treat a patient from Massachusetts, I think it is, here in Alaska, you actually have to, and there's a data breach that involves that patient's record, you actually have to notify not only the Attorney General of the state of Alaska, but the Attorney General for Massachusetts as well. So there gets to be a lot of complexity built into this very quickly. Other administrative components, new hire background checks, information security and compliance training and awareness for not only people that are new hires, but also for existing staff. And these can be, things as simple as information security moments during a staff meeting, or a weekly or monthly email, with a security bulletin in it, things like that. Mandatory reporting of violations. Again, going back to that security officer's role and responsibilities, one policy that we recommend that providers have in place is that if any of their staff become aware of a HIPAA violation, or even specifically a security rule violation, they have to report that to the security officer. Great example is I've got a laptop with a bunch of medical records on it, and I take that laptop home and I can't find it the next day. And, well, it's at my house, it's no big deal, so I go into work and I figure I'll just deal with it when I get home that next night. Well, I get home and I still can't find it. Well, 2 or 3 days goes on like this, and ultimately I discover that laptop has been stolen. I should have reported that on the very first day. At the very first moment, I discovered that laptop was missing, so that the incident response process can begin with the practice, and they can start their process of identifying what all the records were on the laptop, etc., and how do they go forward from there. And of course, there has to be procedures around security and audit log collection, monitoring of those logs, and retention of those logs, as I talked about. After you've put these 3 components of your security management program into place, you essentially go back and do the whole process again on a periodic basis to make sure that your security management program is actually working. Okay, the risk management process. Let's look at that a little bit in detail here. It's the second part of the requirement for Core Objective 14. In plain English, the risk management requirements are, first, you got to make a plan. So out of your risk analysis comes all of these findings. It's up to the practice to make a plan as to how they're going to address those findings. Now, certainly if they've engaged an outside consultant, that consultant has recommendations for them, but they don't necessarily need to do all of the recommendations that the consultant tells them. Again, that's part of the risk management process. For each risk, they can look at it and figure out, can they just avoid this risk? Maybe a slight change to their business process makes that risk entirely go away. Can they or should they just accept the risk? If it's a super low severity risk, it's very appropriate to just accept it. A great example that Jim and I were talking about was you have a husband and wife team that's been providing health care for the last 30 years, and there's no policy in place to do background checks on new hire employees. They haven't had a new hire employee in 30 years. Probably they can accept that risk and move on to other things rather than sitting down and having to write a policy that's never going to actually be used. If the practice decides that they do need to address the risk, is it going to be addressed now or is it going to be addressed later? A lot of things can certainly be addressed relatively quickly and cheaply or easily, but there are some things that are going to cost money and they're going to take time to implement. So if they can address it now, that's great. That can be part of their plan right now, but they also need to make plans to address those risks that are large enough and complex enough that the security controls require maybe an entire project to implement them. Maybe it's upgrading your firewall. That's not something that you're going to run out tomorrow and buy a firewall from Best Buy and go slap it into place. It won't be appropriate. So you'll have to plan that out. And the other thing is identifying which security measures should be used to address those risks. Specifically, whether it's going to be technical security measures, administrative, or physical. Sometimes it's a combination of all three. Once you've identified those components for each of the risks, determine and prioritize your security measure implementation. Again, that's going to come back to cost and equipment, personnel, start and finish dates, and also ongoing maintenance requirements. CMS does make a special note, though, in their guidance that cost alone cannot be the only factor for choosing not to implement a reasonable and appropriate security measure. So just because something's expensive doesn't necessarily mean you end up not doing it. And that was a very interesting note that they made in their guidance there. Okay, you've made your plan as part of the risk management process. Now we're going to actually implement the security measures. Technical, those are firewalls, encryption, backups, alarm systems, cameras, etc. Non-technical, those are going to be policies, procedures, and business practices. You can implement these security measures alone or as part of an overall project. You can also utilize outside vendors to implement these security measures, but beware. And again, this is a comment that was made, I believe it was from CMS, that even though you have an outside vendor implementing those security controls, the covered entity is still responsible for the security rule compliance. Okay, and the last step to a risk management process is once you've gotten your risks from the risk analysis, you've made a plan, you've implemented the controls, now you're going to look back and see if the security measures are actually still working. And this is not a 1, 2, 3 step process. It's more of an ongoing cycle. So periodically, you're going to go back and evaluate your current security controls. Are they actually working? Digital Securus performed an assessment of a really fancy intrusion detection system made to catch hackers as they break into networks for a client a few years ago. And what we found was half of their intrusion detection systems weren't even functional. So part of the evaluating and maintaining your security is just checking to make sure stuff's still turned on. One of the things that DS focuses on greatly is, do the security measures in place actually reduce risk? A lot of times we'll see security controls that have been put in, especially by outside IT vendors, that they look fancy, they sound fancy, they cost a lot of money, but they don't actually do anything to reduce risk. And that's where we're very, very pragmatic in our approach to information security. If it doesn't actually reduce risk, get rid of it. That being said, think about it very, very carefully to make sure that it's actually not worth it before you remove it from your environment. Part of evaluating and maintaining your security is also looking for new risks. And that's going back to, we're going to do another risk analysis. You're also going to be looking at technology as it evolves to see if there are any new or better security measures that you could implement that may be more effective, more efficient, or even cost less money. When it comes down to the bottom line for risk management, the real question is the electronic PHI reasonably and appropriately protected? and that's really a subjective call, and that's where the best practice of engaging an outside consultant really helps, because you're relying on their knowledge and experience to make that subjective call for you, rather than trying to make that call, make that judgment when you don't have enough information or background knowledge on it, into the various security risks. So really, that's the bottom line there. Is your EPHI adequately protected? So some final thoughts on risk analysis and risk management. You know, I said earlier, it's not a one-time deal. It kind of is for stage 1 meaningful use. But really, the HIPAA security rule requires that risk analysis and risk management be implemented or be followed, the processes be followed as needed. And I wanted to expound a little bit on as needed and give you some ideas as to what CMS means by that. It could mean periodically. For some companies, that's annually. For some, it's biannually, every 2 years. Some industries even do it every 5 years, which I think is maybe stretching it a bit. But then there are some that do it every 6 months or even quarterly as well. Another time that you can implement your risk analysis and risk management process is when new technologies are deployed. If you get a new system or a new type of computer system into your environment, run it through your risk analysis process and identify any risks that could be associated with that new system before you implement it and take it live. If you change physical locations, or if there are major upgrades or changes done to the facility that you're in, you'll want to go back and do a new risk analysis around the physical security of your location to make sure that the controls that are in place are still appropriate. Anytime you have substantial staff changeover, you're going to want to have a new risk analysis done. A lot of times, if there are new owners that are brought in, they may have different thresholds for risk tolerance. They may want to accept more risk, or they may want to accept less risk, and then you have to go back and do the risk analysis and make sure that you implement the controls commensurate with their tolerance for risk. Ideally, risk management and risk analysis get integrated into your business processes so that it's an ongoing process rather than point-in-time events. And really, that's the best way to implement risk analysis and risk management. Okay, enough with risk management, risk analysis. Let's go on to something a little bit more fun, the Omnibus. And that's actually, I think it's like a 1927 Omnibus. I thought it would be kind of interesting that we're all now riding this bus. Wanted to share with you 5 things about security that are included in the new Omnibus rule that went into effect on September 23rd, I believe. Sorry, it actually went into effect back in March. And covered entities had to be in compliance by September 23rd. First, business associates are now directly liable for their own privacy rule, security rule, and breach rule compliance. That being said, covered entities are also still liable as well. Business associate subcontractors are now considered to be business associates as well. Before the Omnibus rule, that was a little bit muddy, and in fact, a lot of the data breaches that we have been seeing to date aren't directly from covered entities, but they are from subcontractors to business associates of the covered entity. So the Omnibus rule has cleared that up, and they have said that not only now are covered entities required to comply with the security rule, the privacy rule, and the breach rule, but also business associates are, and their subcontractors are also required to comply with the rules. Covered entities must obtain assurances from business associates, and those business associates must obtain assurances from their subcontractors that they are security rule compliant. So the Omnibus rule, in my opinion, really went a long ways towards really truly holding everyone accountable for the protection of electronic PHI. I was very happy to see that. On the flip side, that means that Digital Securus now has to stand up and attest that we are HIPAA security rule compliant. We've actually had to make some changes to our own business to do that. And we're a security company. The breach rule reporting threshold has a new objective criteria. It used to be that if there was a data breach, you had to report it if you felt there was a risk of harm for the patients whose records were compromised. CMS really, or actually this is HHS, really decided that that was kind of impossible to do, because you can't get in the head of the bad guy or even in the head of the person who has received these records in an unauthorized fashion and figure out what their intentions are. So instead, the new threshold is that if there's a breach, you must report it unless you perform a risk analysis of the incident and you determine that there is a low probability that the records were actually compromised. And so that's a far more objective measure. It also really puts the burden of proof on the covered entity to prove that yes, there was a breach, but it's not reportable because the records weren't compromised. And there's a lot of nuances that go into that. And if you have questions on that, we'd absolutely be willing to talk to you offline about the intricacies of that. Here's another one that's actually pretty important. Covered entities compliance history with the HIPAA security rule is actually now relevant to the determination of civil penalties for data breaches. So what this comes down to is if you've, as a covered entity, have made a good faith effort to be compliant with the security rule for many, many years, and you still suffer a data breach, your penalties are likely to be less than if you're a covered entity who has just thumbed its nose at the security rule and not done anything, and all of a sudden there's a data breach. Essentially, HHS is saying they are now willing to punish covered entities with higher fines if those covered entities have not been making a good faith effort to follow the security rule. I've included a URL here in the slides. This is a really helpful website that I found, the HIPAAsurvivalguide.com. It's got some great information on the Omnibus rule. I encourage everybody to go look at this. I think they do a great job of summarizing the over 500 pages of the Omnibus rule into something that won't put you to sleep in about 38 seconds.
Yeah, let me jump in just for a moment. So for all of you folks, sometimes folks need to break off toward the end of a webinar. We anticipate that we will upload this transmission, including the slide deck. Give us about a week to upload it on our website. And for those of you that don't know the website URL, ak-health.org.
Good deal. Thank you, Jim. I appreciate that. Okay, we're moving down towards the end of our presentation here. I did want to share with you the top 10 assessment findings that Digital Securus repeatedly identifies as we're doing risk analyses for our clients in the medical industry. First and foremost, there's never been a previous risk analysis performed. The HIPAA security rule has required a risk analysis actually since its inception, and certainly since the HITECH Act. Bottom line, if you have an EHR, you need to be doing a risk analysis on a periodic basis. No electronic security management plan. We talked about what that security management plan looks like. No physical security plan. Insufficient policies for best practices and security rule compliance. This isn't a great shock. Even information security related companies oftentimes are so busy doing their own business of providing consulting that even they have to build out their security policies. As Digital Securus moves towards Omnibus rule compliance, we discovered we had several policies that we had to just sit down and write out. It's things that we've been doing in practice but never have written down. So you have to write down those policies. The mantra of the auditor is, if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. Next one is a big one, data at rest not encrypted, and there's no compensating controls around it. Data stored on hard drives, data stored on laptops especially, removable media like thumb drives, CDs, etc. The HIPAA security rule says that where appropriate and reasonable, ePHI must be encrypted. A lot of covered entities that we're finding, that we're working with, were under the impression that that addressable meant that it was optional, and that's not actually true. According to HHS's guidance, addressable means that you have to do it if it's reasonable and appropriate. If you don't feel it's reasonable and appropriate, you can document why you don't feel it's reasonable and appropriate, and also show what your compensating controls are. Bottom line, when it comes down to it, laptops are one of the single biggest causes of ePHI loss and ePHI data breaches. I think when I was doing my analysis of the wall of shame, like 26% of all instances were due to a loss of a laptop. 36 or 38% were due to theft of data. And we're even now seeing that desktop machines in practices and even servers are being stolen. Medical identity theft was identified as the single fastest growing criminal trend on the internet during 2012. So bad guys are starting to home in on this. You absolutely have to encrypt your data at rest. When there is a theft of an asset containing PHI, encryption makes that a non-event. Data not encrypted on high-risk ePHI assets, talked about that with laptops. Backups are another big issue that we found. Organizations are making backups of their PHI, they're sending it off-site, and those backup tapes fall off the back of a truck. They get lost, and whenever that happens, that's a data breach. And now you have to figure out, how much data was on that tape, etc. It goes back to the same rule with laptops. It's so easy nowadays with modern backup software to implement encryption in the backups. It's really just a given to go ahead and do that. No security training program. A lot of practices just don't have that new hire orientation as far as the HIPAA security rule goes. We find that most practices are very, very strong on the privacy rule side of things, but they don't communicate the security rule very well, if at all. And that's true not only for new hires, but as an ongoing awareness and training program for all employees that handle ePHI. That's actually required by the HIPAA security rule. No log collection, monitoring, and alerting for appropriate security events. I put appropriate in there for a reason. The vast majority of the environments that we have looked at to date maybe have logging turned on in the Active Directory controller, but the logging is not set appropriately. Specifically, it doesn't track successful logins. It only tracks failed login attempts when someone goofs up their password. Successful login attempts are crucial from an auditing standpoint to determine appropriate usage, as well as from a behavioral standpoint when trying to identify unauthorized use from, say, a hacker who is masquerading as a legitimate user. Again, monitoring those security events, you have to have a process in place and training for the person who's looking at the logs, and then, of course, retaining those logs for the 6 years that's required by the security rule. And then last but certainly not least, There's no documented incident response or data breach reporting procedures. And in the few cases where we found they were documented, they've never been actually tested with a tabletop exercise. So, wrapping things up here real quick, stage 1, meaningful use attestation, requires completion of the risk analysis and risk management processes at least one time prior to attestation. And the HIPAA security rule compliance requires essentially everything that we've talked about, and ideally it's an ongoing process. I think those are really the salient points that I wanted to make today. I do want to open it up to questions. I'm going to unmute the lines. I would ask that if there's background noise in the particular location where you're at, if you would mute your phone, it'll make it easier for everybody else to hear questions and the respective answers as well. So let's see if I can figure out how to do this here. Okay. Are there any questions for either Jim or myself in relation to today's presentation?
I didn't get the address. Your phone beeped when you were given the address to where the you can go online to see the reprint of this.
Absolutely. So so our website is the Alaska eHealth Network is AeHN eHealth EHEALTH.org.
Okay.
Did you get that?
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Absolutely. And would you mind going just to the last slide, please? Yep, absolutely. I was just going to do that here. And there's the addresses and contact information as well. Yeah, what I wanted to indicate is we would like to consider ourselves at the Alaska eHealth Network your trusted advisor. And so if you do have any questions, please, and you have a point of contact, either Aaron Adine Ackelstad, Georgiana Jorgensen, or myself, Jim Landon, please follow through. And I also wanted to mention one other thing, a bit of information that Mike and I were talking about that may be of value is we also have we have downloaded from the National Learning Consortium an information security policy template, and I think as Mike indicated, there's lots of complexity associated with this. We'd like to break it down. We'd like to make it really useful to you, and so this template you may find is very helpful, in addition to AeHN itself having our own privacy and security policies available for download, but that doesn't necessarily supplement the need to do an assessment.
Yeah, good point. Other questions? We'll go ahead and leave the line open here for another minute or so. If there are any questions, please feel free to speak up. Additionally, you can contact any of us at our email addresses on the screen there. We'd be happy to answer any questions you have via an email as well.
Quick minute.
Okay, well, if there are no further questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up the presentation for today. I thank you all for taking time to attend. Hopefully you found this information useful, and we look forward to talking to you again in the future.